Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and it's kind of hard to believe that we're coming up to the 14-year anniversary of the death of possibly the only real person in Chris's life that, to be honest, I actually feel quite bad for. There's a lot of there are people, mostly people that Chris has harassed in the past, that I do feel bad for because they had no qualms whatsoever. But Bob Chandler, we can't forget the fact that this was Chris's father. This is somebody that Chris looked up to for many, many years. This is, but with that being said, as we are coming up to the 14-year anniversary, I thought that, well, the way Chris handled the death of his father is a very interesting display. So I thought what we should do is just, well, we'll pay Bob Chandler respect coming up to the anniversary, and, well, let's get started, shall we? When Mr. C left this universe to become his sonotube form self, that he has been for years now as the internet lumberjack that he was, he left that impression of it's time to stop this you-know-what. That's apparently Chris's opinion on Bob's death, it would seem. Oh dear. On the 6th of September 2011, Chris's father, Bob Chandler, died of congestive heart failure. Bob's death marked a significant change in the trolling of Chris, as the vast majority of the trolls associated with the classic era voluntarily retired from trolling him, knowing that he was deeply depressed by his father's passing. Only a few of these trolls still remain active as observers on Kiwi farms, and a trolling renaissance did not begin until much later in the decade. To that end, I think it's only like Marvin, the guy in the pickle suit, is the only one who is still active. Certainly, we know fine well No has nothing more to do with this. But that might be more as a result of what Chris would do just about 10 years later. Bob's final months. A breakdown of Bob's final months reads as follows. On the 24th of March 2011, Bob claimed in a cell phone call with the PCA assassins to have cancer of some type. This is the first recorded example of Bob telling anyone outside of his family that he had cancer. His language in the video suggests that he may have been diagnosed on the 24th of March or in the few days prior. On the 23rd of April 2011, in an email to Jackie, Chris revealed that Bob had received surgery for colon cancer. On the 20th of July 2011, it was revealed that Bob knew about Chris's cross-dressing tendencies and, like Bob, vehemently disapproved of them. On the 29th of August 2011, Chris mentioned that Bob was in an ill and sickly shut-in and he was suffering from feet bloatings. Presumably this was a result of insect infestation, and he was being bitten all over his body, which we'll get into shortly. In early September of 2011, Bob was rushed by an ambulance to Martha Jefferson Hospital with heart failure. It was discovered later that Bob had been put into a quarantine state when he arrived because his body was covered in bug bites and he posed a contamination risk. On the 6th of that month, he died aged 84. Chris and Barbara were present at the ICU at his side, and Chris said that he held Bob's hand during his last 15 minutes of life. Out of respect of him and his family, the Quickie was closed for a week from the 12th to the 19th of September, with the start date coinciding with the day Bob's funeral service was held. Site visitors were directed to a page which simply read Robert Franklin Chandler Jr., 1927 to 2011. It is said that Marvin and other trolls, using the Jackie identity as a catfish, attempted to contact Chris over the phone shortly after Bob's death for unclear reasons. Chris was noted to be audibly upset as he cried throughout the conversation. While the audio was recorded and archived on what is referred to as the black tape by some historians, the contents of the call were never released publicly due to Chris's miserable emotional state. The trolls who participated in the call realized after the fact that it was simply too soon to try to reach out to Chris in this fashion and for a change, opted to respect his privacy for once. The black tape either still exists in the hands of the trolls who participated in its creation, or it has been lost to time. The cause of the death, according to Chris. In an email leaked on the 22nd of March 2014, Chris claimed that the stress from being targeted by trolls led to Bob's heart attack. And the total stress killed my father prematurely. If not for those trolls, he would still be alive and would have likely lived beyond 2015. Chris, I'm going to go on a limb and say that is nowhere near true. Now, the reason sort of why, again, with the reason why this whole article is called "The Death of Bob Chandler" is because Chris, it's almost become a little bit of an escape, not so much an escapist fantasy, but rather a coping mechanism for Chris. Because as opposed to dying as a result of multiple issues relating to heart disease, recovering from things like surgery about colon cancer, heart failure, the fact that it was possible that her blood pressure could have been as a result of being contaminated through bug bites. Irregardless of what or whether or not Bob's frail old body just was now beginning to shut down every way it could, as opposed to things that medically make sense, Chris seems to go for the idea that if it wasn't for the trolls, or rather for the fact that Chris's behaviour had led to increased amounts of trolling, Chris is under the impression that Bob would have still been around in at least 2015. Yeah, for some reason, Chris doesn't seem to make the connection that, well, maybe if I dealt with this situation properly, if I cared about my father's well-being, Bob might have been here, might still be here. But what I also think Chris fails to understand is that what evidence does Chris have to suggest that he would live to as far as 2015? And for that matter, what difference do you think that would have made Chris? It seems to suggest the idea that Chris was under the impression that his dad was going to live forever. Let's bear this in mind, guys. Again, Bob was 84 by the time he died. Even if he had lived to 2015, he would have been at least 88. And I don't think Chris's concept of like the measurement of time is more of an art than a science. But I don't really feel like it's worked out in Chris's mind about how even people in their 80s, it's not necessarily unheard of that many of them go through some level of end of life incidents and stuff like that. It's and I don't know why Chris doesn't think in terms like that, but well, that's why I think he's trying to relieve some of this pressure by saying it was the trolls' fault. Though certainly Bob and Chris going to Burger King every morning was hardly going to improve things. Nor does it make Chris realize that he was probably in no position to start saying about how long people are going to live to when, because Chris is not exactly a spring onion himself. Anyway, moving on. Years later, in 2017, Chris revised his claim and said that Bob was killed after hospital staff surprised him with a loud noise. He went on to say that he had more freedom when Bob was alive. What a selfish prick. I wish I could go back to September 5th, 2011 and stop the staff from making the loud noise that killed my father with stressful surprise. I had more freedom when he was alive. Outside of the fact that changing your story on something like this is a pretty scummy thing to do, let's not forget that apparently on the same day when his father died, Chris made a sort of post on Facebook looking for a boyfriend-free girl, even though he was supposed to be in some sort of relationship with Jackie. It's a confusing affair, to say the least. And Chris saying he has more freedom. And again, Chris really was going to just be under the impression his parents were going to be alive forever, and Chris wouldn't have to face up to any responsibility whatsoever. I'm going to make a few short videos like later on about like responsibility and accountability and stuff like that. Because one thing that does actually make me quite angry when it comes to Chris is that Chris thinks that he doesn't have to handle or deal with any of these things. When if Chris actually had dealt with these things, he would have had a much, maybe not the not a better life, but one that was actually relieved of a lot of stress and pressure. Because naturally, if Chris was that concerned about stress, he would have actually have taken steps to do something about it. But it's only because Chris won't do anything about anything that poses a situation to him. Well, that would explain half of the reasons why he is the way he is. Because as long as he can blame somebody else or blame the fact that he has no motivation to change. The obituary. Both Barbara and Chris collaborated in writing Bob's obituary, which was published in 2 local papers. Main points of the obituary, apart from the standard birth date, date of birth, and next of kin, include text going into unusual detail about what Bob did at General Electric, the location of the memorial service to follow on a later date at Wesley Memorial United Methodist Church, the church that Bob, and Chris used to frequent together. This is the same church that Rocky Shoemaker counselled Chris from. And also a footnote asking readers to not donate flowers but to donate money to Barbara and Chris. With Chris taking part in writing the obituary, it's amazing that the writing stayed focused on Bob and did not once mention solitude or become about Chris, except for the request of the money at the end. Now, whether or not it was Chris's idea to say donate money, as maybe Barbara had a hand in this, I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, Robert Franklin Chandler Jr., 84, of Ruckersville, passed away the morning of Tuesday, September 6, 2011, at Martha Jefferson Hospital ICU, surrounded by family, pastor, and hospital staff. He was born on the 4th of September 1927 in Texas, the son of the late Robert Franklin Chandler Sr. and Jean Holloman Chandler. On June 7, 1980, he married Barbara Ann Weston, who survives. And the couple gave birth to a son, Christian Weston Chandler, who survives. Also surviving is ex-wife Patricia and their shared son, Dr. David Allen Chandler, who survives, and daughter Carol Suzanne Chandler survives. He graduated from Auburn University with a degree in engineering. He served in the United States Army Seoul, Korea in the Signal Corps during the Korean War. He worked for General Electric as an engineer with steels, plastics, etc. He also had patents for the controls for plastic molding machines. Without him, we would not have even a simple plastic funnel. Also surviving are granddaughter Savannah Chandler, the daughter of David Allen Chandler, and his wife Kimberly. A funeral service will be held at Monticello Memory Gardens in Charlottesville, Virginia, 10 a.m., Monday, September the 12th, 2011. A memorial service to follow on a later date at Wesley Memorial United Methodist Church. Instead of flowers, you may make monetary donations to his widow, Barbara Chandler, and son, Christian Chandler. I was about to say that actually it's a very dignified and a very well-read obituary. Possibly up until the point where, they said give money to Barbara and Chris, but not to, Savannah, not to David, not to Carol, not even to Cole Smithy. Now, it might have been true that they didn't want to have anything to do with Bob at this point, because Bob's relation with David and Carol is not necessarily the greatest. But I heard they did still go. But that's how it is. We know fine well that probably Cole Smithy was never going to have anything to do with the Chandlers ever again. I can understand why, and probably that's just how it should be, really. Maybe, but maybe not. In memoriam. Bob is often seen as a gregarious, hard-working man, all things considered, who tried, albeit without success, his best to refine Chris into someone that could at least pass for a responsible adult, giving him mock job interviews and chaperoning him on dates, where he proved, unsurprisingly, more adept at charming the date than Chris, but stopped altogether in his later years, leaving Chris to his own devices. On the other hand, we have him to thank for some of his son's more backward worldviews. He managed to alienate his other children enough that his daughter didn't attend his funeral or keep in touch while he was still alive. He helped Chris to construct bizarre conspiracy theories to justify trespassing and the like, among other things. He, like Barbara, enabled Chris's crippling dependence on them, general immaturity and irresponsibility, and his myriad of other flaws. He bailed out his son repeatedly and never really let Chris experience the consequences of his own misinformed life decisions. He never made any serious effort to correct his son's glaring character flaws and shortcomings, even when he caught him masturbating in the kitchen. The few times he did intervene, it wasn't even for Chris's own benefit, but to shake off the trolls and the health department of Greene County. He also did not make any real attempt to provide for Chris's future, beyond insuring the tugboat. He left all his money to Barbara, who promptly wasted it all on lawyer fees. A conscientious parent would have anticipated this and put some money in a trust account for Chris. Not that Chris would have handled the money any better. Better yet, he could have given the money to his son Alan, Carol, or his own granddaughter. While some like to remember Bob as a kind-hearted, albeit ignorant old man who tried his best to be a good father, others see him as a remnant of a bygone era who was responsible for molding Chris into the person he is today. Well, to that I say, Chris was born whilst, Bob and Bob were both quite old. And I think elderly parents who were nearly 40 years Chris's senior, maybe, I don't necessarily believe their worldviews are going to be necessarily in line with things that go on in the modern world. It's not always the case, but you kind of have to see it a little bit that way. But then again, many of us don't have that sort of disadvantage of having parents 40, 50 years our seniors. That's all I'm going to say about that. Chris's beliefs on Bob's afterlife. During the Idea Guy saga, and we'll be covering this more in the Robert Chew section, Chris believed that Bob had been reincarnated into Quickville as a half-son of Chew named Robert Chew. He has maintained belief in this since, and sometimes substitutes the Robert Chew name when speaking about Bob as a person, which is about as insane as it gets, and, well, that's kind of really what we've got time for, ladies and gentlemen. And the thing I kind of wanted to bring to light after 14 years of the death of Bob Chandler, well, all I have to say is this, is that, you know what? I can't tell you whether or not he was about as good as a role model as Chris was probably ever going to get. But I do also see it kind of strange in the idea that out of all of Bob's children, Chris is probably the only one who actually thought of him quite fondly. Maybe it's because Chris really did have nowhere else to go and therefore he was kind of clutching at straws. Or maybe it's also true that Chris actually did see more than many others would see. And so Chris just kind of took him for granted. How fortunate, to actually be in a situation where we can take people for granted, eh? But with all that being said and done, I hope all of you guys enjoyed this article, and I will see all of you guys again next time. Thank you.